I just first like to say thank you to Ben for asking me to speak today, especially because you've combined like my two favourite things in the world, which is like Lord of the Rings and the feminine genius, so into one topic. So thank you very much. I apologise, my slides are very simple. I'm afraid I threw them together at the last moment, so they're fairly basic compared to other ones that you've seen today. So, let's move. So, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien is a story all about fair love. It is a story about the beauty, goodness, and grandeur of sacrificial love. In this presentation, I will examine the three main female characters in Lord of the Rings in light of what St. John Paul II called the feminine genius. However, before I begin discussing the feminine genius in relation to Lord of the Rings, I first would like to make some comments about the book in general that I think will help in understanding Tolkien's female characters. As many of you would know, Tolkien was a devout Catholic. He wrote in one of his letters that The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. In identifying the genre of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien rejected the label of fantasy and asserted that it was a mythological story. He used the term myth not as is commonly used today to refer to something that is untrue, but rather in the sense that we might talk about Greek or Roman mythology. Tolkien had a particular love of Norse mythology, which had a profound influence on his writings. In this sense of the word myth, it denotes a story which is fictional but which contains profound and timeless truths about life and human nature. Such stories are meant to teach us something of great value for our own lives. Indeed, Tolkien believed that myths were the only means by which some truths could be expressed. Tolkien considered the story of Christ in the Gospels to be a true myth, having all the hallmarks of a myth and containing profound eternal truths. However, it also really happened. Christ really did live and die and was resurrected. It was this belief of Tolkien's in the true myth of Christianity that convinced his friend C.S. Lewis, who was an agnostic at the time that he first met Tolkien, to take another look at Christianity. For anyone interested in reading more about Tolkien's belief in the importance of myths, I recommend Joseph Pearce's book, Tolkien, Man and Myth. So we can identify Lord of the Rings as a Christian myth. It is a mythological story set in an imaginary world, inhabited by imaginary beings, and yet it contains profound truths about us as human beings, about life, about death, about good and evil, and about true love. And I believe this is the reason for the book's enduring popularity. It communicates eternal truths through beauty, the beauty of story and heroic romance. We can tell it is a Christian myth because unlike pagan mythological stories where a hero goes on a quest in order to obtain a treasure, in Lord of the Rings it is all about a hero, Frodo Baggins, who goes on a journey in order to destroy a treasure, the Ring of Power. He defeats many enemies and monsters along the way, but it's all done with the aim of destroying the ring so that it cannot be used for evil. Rather than seeking his own power and glory, Frodo renounces his comfort and his desires to go on the perilous journey to destroy the ring, thereby preventing the reign of the Dark Lord Sauron over Middle-earth. Frodo and his friends lay down their lives in the cause of good. As St. John's Gospel tells us, greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. So Lord of the Rings is essentially a story about sacrificial love, since it is only through sacrificial love that evil is ultimately defeated. And surely that is the very definition of a Christian myth. In accordance with the genre of myth, Tolkien's characters are archetypal. An archetype is an original pattern or mode which is reflected or copied, reoccurring again and again in stories and myths. And some of you might have heard Dr. Jordan Peterson talk a lot about the importance of archetypes in literature. The most common is the hero archetype. And C.S. Lewis explained archetypal characters when he wrote that much in a realistic work would be done by character delineation is here done simply by making the character an elf, a dwarf, or a hobbit. The imagined beings have their insides on the outside. They are visible souls. Frodo is a reflection of the hero archetype and of the everyman archetype, since as a hobbit, he represents the ordinary folk who are considered insignificant by the world. From a Christian perspective, Frodo is also a type of Jesus Christ, since he is willing to lay down his life to save Middle-earth from the Dark Lord. His carrying the ring to Mount Doom has been likened to Christ carrying his cross to Calvary. While it is true that the female characters are few and far between in Lord of the Rings, those that are depicted demonstrate great sacrificial love, and in doing so strike powerful and unexpected blows against evil, evoking the proto-evangelium, where in the book of Genesis, after the fall, God declares that the woman and the serpent, the evil one, will be opposed to each other, and the prediction is made that the woman's seed will crush the head of the serpent. For Christians, of course, the archetype of the feminine is the Virgin Mary, just as Christ is the archetype of the masculine. The three most important female characters in Lord of the Rings, Galadriel and Arwen, who are both elves, and Eowyn, a mortal woman, can all be considered types of the Virgin Mary. They all exhibit traits of the feminine genius. I want to suggest that each of these three characters represent the three different ways the feminine genius is most concretely manifested, in that as woman, as mother, as bride, and as sister-daughter. But what exactly is the feminine genius? In his Theology of the Body, Pope John Paul II speaks of the feminine genius as a sensitivity towards the person. A woman has this orientation toward the person by her very nature. Both masculinity and femininity reflect something of God's nature, since both were created in his image and likeness, as we are told at the beginning of Genesis. The essence of femininity is a call to motherhood, while the essence of masculinity is a call to fatherhood. And this can be realised both spiritually and physically, since the human person is a unity of body and soul. All women are called to spiritual motherhood, and some are also called to physical motherhood. Motherhood is an orientation toward the person and an awareness of the dignity and the worth of the person. It should also be said that in his writings on women, John Paul II was greatly influenced by philosopher and Carmelite nun St. Edith Stein. Stein wrote extensively on womanhood, and she maintained that this orientation towards the person entailed a desire for the right development of the person, for the person to achieve wholeness. A woman desires this for herself and others. Stein also wrote of woman's greatest desire as being to achieve a loving union with the man. Motherhood also requires an openness and an acceptance of the other. John Paul II wrote in his letter to women, but perhaps more than men, women acknowledge the person because they see persons with their hearts. And this leads me to discuss the character that I think most strikingly resembles Our Lady in The Lord of the Rings, the Lady Galadriel. Tolkien wrote, "I think it is true that I owe much of this character to Catholic teaching and imagination about Mary. Galadriel is the most maternal of the female characters. She is a protector, intercessor, and moral guide. She gives encouragement and hope to the ring bearer and his companions. It is interesting that when she first meets the Fellowship of the Ring, as Frodo and his companions call themselves, she seems to see beyond their exteriors and right into their souls. And I quote, "She held them with her eyes and in silence looked searchingly at each of them in turn. None save Legolas and Aragorn could long endure her glance. Sam quickly blushed and hung his head. She is more compassionate than her husband Celeborn, who is considered wisest of all the elves. When Celeborn is tempted to banish the dwarf Gimli from the elvish realm of Lothlorien because of a long-held animosity between elves and dwarves, it is Galadriel who stays his hand, expressing sympathy for Gimli's plight." And I quote, "She looked upon Gimli, who sat glowering and sad, and she smiled, and the dwarf, hearing the names given in his own ancient tongue, looked up and met her eyes, and it seemed to him that he looked suddenly into the heart of an enemy and saw there love and understanding. Wonder came into his face, and then he smiled in answer." Here Galadriel shows great charity and sensitivity towards the other. She sees the other with the eyes of her heart. In another echo of the proto-evangelium, the Lady Galadriel is positioned by Tolkien in direct opposition to the Dark Lord Sauron. While she has the power and insight to be able to perceive the thoughts of the Dark Lord, he in turn is unable to know her mind despite his efforts. Galadriel says to Frodo, "I perceive the Dark Lord and I know his mind, or all of his mind that concerns the elves, and he gropes ever to see me and my thought, but still the door is closed." Lothlorien, which is the land of the lady, is directly opposed to the land of Mordor. As one of the elves explains to the hobbits, in this high place you may see the two powers that are opposed one to the other, and ever they strive now in thought. But whereas the light perceives the heart of darkness, its own secret has not been discovered. Galadriel also shows humility and self-sacrifice in refusing the ring of power when Frodo offers it to her. She is wise enough and humble enough to know that if she were to take the ring, the temptation to use it to further her own desires and achieve greater power for herself would be too much. She refuses the ring and humbly accepts the path laid out for her by divine providence, that she and her people should diminish in power and leave Middle-earth once the ring is destroyed. I pass the test, she said. I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel. Like the Virgin Mary, Galadriel has intercessory powers, and Sam cries out to her when he and Frodo are in mortal danger in Mordor, in the same way that a Catholic might cry out to Our Lady for help. As a parting gift when the Fellowship leave Lothlorien, Galadriel gives to Frodo a crystal phial containing the light of Erendel's star amid the waters of her fountain. When they are in danger in the land of Mordor, Sam uses the phial to illuminate his path and ward off his enemies. And it occurred to me that this could be seen kind of reminiscent of the bottles of crystal clear Lourdes water that Catholics collect and believe have miraculous powers from the spring in the grotto where Our Lady appeared to St. Bernadette. Now I will move on to Galadriel's granddaughter, the Lady Arwen. If Galadriel is symbolic of the feminine as mother, Arwen could be said to represent the feminine as bride. Of the three main female characters, Arwen appears the least in the narrative, and we hardly hear her speak at all. Yet her self-sacrificial love is so great, and her choice has enormous ramifications for Middle-earth. As an elf, Arwen is immortal, but in choosing to marry Aragorn, who is a mortal man, she gives up her immortality. Aragorn is forbidden to marry Arwen by her father Elrond until he becomes king of both Gondor and Arnor. It is therefore his great love for Arwen and his desire to be united with her in marriage that inspires Aragorn to take up his rightful place as king. It is the return of the king that allows peace and stability to be established once again in Middle-earth and for evil to be defeated. Aragorn can be considered a type of Christ the King who returns in triumph and marries his bride, the Church. This evokes the great wedding feast of the Lamb in the book of Revelation, when there is enormous rejoicing in heaven. Just as Christ the bridegroom and his bride have to endure many trials and sufferings before they are united, so too Aragorn and Arwen had to wait many years and make great sacrifices before they're able to marry. When Aragorn is finally crowned as king, it is as if there is a renewal of the kingdom. Everything is made new again. Aragorn himself seems to have transformed as his full glory is revealed. And we read, "When Tolkien arose, all that beheld him gazed in silence, for it seemed to them that he was revealed to them now for the first time. Tall as the sea kings of old, he stood above all that were near. Ancient of days he seemed, and yet in the flower of manhood. And wisdom sat upon his brow, and strength and healing were in his hands, and a light was about him." Then we hear of the transformation of the kingdom of Gondor following his coronation. In his time, the city was made more fair than it had ever been, even in the days of its first glory. And it was filled with trees and with fountains, and its gates were wrought of mithril and steel, and its streets were paved with white marble. It's almost as if there is a new heaven and a new earth, just as in the book of Revelation. And all this culminates in the wedding of Aragorn and Arwen, the great event that Aragorn has worked so long and hard for, and that both of them have made enormous sacrifices in order to achieve. Their marriage also provides a type of healing and redemption for Middle-earth, as the race of men are united with the elves. As Frodo sees the bride, Arwen Evenstar, coming to meet her bridegroom, we read, "And Frodo, when he saw her come glimmering in the evening with stars upon her brow, and a sweet fragrance about her, was moved with great wonder. And he said to Gandalf, 'At last I understand why we have waited. This is the ending. Now not day only shall be beloved, but night too shall be beautiful and blessed, and all its fear pass away.' Then the king welcomed his guests, and as they alighted, and Elrond surrendered the sceptre and laid the hand of his daughter in the hand of the king, and together they went into the high city, and all the stars flowered. And Aragorn, the king Elessar, wedded Arwen Undomiel in the city of the kings upon the day of midsummer, and the tale of their long waiting and labours was come to fulfilment. The reference to Arwen as the even star of her people and the description of her with stars upon her brow calls to mind the woman in the book of Revelation who wears a crown of 12 stars upon her head. Just as the redemption of humankind was made possible because a young woman in Nazareth said yes at the Annunciation, so too in Lord of the Rings the return of the King and the flowering of peace in Middle-earth is achieved because Arwen is willing to give up her immortality and give herself in the self-sacrificial love of marriage to Aragorn. Arwen also demonstrates an acceptance of the other as an elf willing to love a mortal man, and also a humility in accepting the call of divine providence over her life, as she chooses to become Queen of Gondor in marrying Aragorn despite the sacrifice this entailed. And so I move on to the character of Éowyn, and I think Éowyn is perhaps the most interesting of Tolkien's female characters, and I think she can be viewed as representing the sister-daughter manifestation of the feminine genius. As elves, Galadriel and Arwen are almost angelic in their goodness, but Éowyn is a mortal woman. In some aspects of her character, she is a type of Our Lady, but she also represents woman after the fall, as we see her weaknesses and her vulnerability. As a young woman who's lost both her parents, Éowyn is raised by her uncle, King Theoden, who refers to her as sister-daughter. As she cares for her aging uncle, she watches the kingdom of Rohan degenerate, as the devious and manipulative Grima Wormtongue holds sway over the king, convincing him he cannot trust even his own kindred. As a woman in a man's world where battle and bloodshed are part of life, Éowyn begins to lose hope for her future, and she desires honour and glory for herself so she can live a life of freedom. She falls in love with Aragorn because of what he represents: nobility, renown, high status and respect. When she learns that Aragorn cannot return her love, she falls into despair and she seeks death in battle. Tolkien has often been criticised for his sentimentalised and stereotypical female characters, yet in the character of Éowyn we find remarkable insight on Tolkien's part into the plight of a woman who feels oppressed. Indeed, some of Éowyn's words sound like something you might hear from modern-day feminists. When Aragorn refuses to allow Éowyn to ride into battle with the men, she responds, "All your words are but to say you are a woman and your part is in the house. But when the men have died in battle and honour, you have leave to be burned in the house, for the men will need it no more." It is a voice of frustration, bitterness and cynicism and despair, and yet clearly Tolkien has great sympathy for such feelings. Later in the narrative, when Éowyn has been wounded in battle, Gandalf the wizard explains her state of mind to her brother Éomer. He says, "You had horses and deeds of arms and the free fields, but she, born in the body of a maid, had a spirit and a courage at least the match of yours, yet she was doomed to wait upon an old man whom she loved as a father, and watch him falling into a mean, dishonoured dotage, and her part seemed to her more ignoble than that of the staff that he leaned on." Éowyn's dissatisfaction with her narrow and restricted life speaks of that aspect of the feminine genius that Edith Stein wrote about, and that is the desire to achieve wholeness and right development of the human soul, both in herself and others. Éowyn desires to flourish as a human person by reaching her full potential. Reminiscent of St. Joan of Arc, Éowyn, engulfed by despair, rides into battle disguised as a man, and in one of the most surprising plot twists of the novel, she wins renown by defeating the Lord of the Nazgul, the Dark Lord's most powerful servant. Once again, we see an allusion to the proto-evangelium as the woman is pitted against evil. As Éowyn stands on the battlefield face to face with her powerful enemy, she is spurred to courage by her great love for King Theoden, who lies wounded on the ground. She warns the Lord of the Nazgul that if he touches the king, she will strike. Her enemy answers that no living man may hinder him, to which she responds, "But no living man am I, you look upon a woman." She eventually lands the mortal blow upon the Lord of the Nazgul. One would have expected Aragorn or Gandalf to have killed the Lord of the Nazgul, but Tolkien reserved such an heroic act for a woman. This theme in Tolkien of the weak and the small, such as hobbits or women achieving such heroic acts, is perhaps a reflection of the tendency to exalt the weak and humble over the great and powerful in the world in the New Testament. As St. Paul wrote, "God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. It is Eowyn's great sacrificial love for her uncle King Theoden that leads her to perform one of the most heroic acts in the book. She willingly risks her own life in seeking to save his, and it is this aspect of love that defeats evil. Even though Eowyn committed the sin of falling into despair, she is redeemed by her great love for others. This calls to mind the sinful woman in Luke's Gospel of whom Christ said, "Her sins which are many are forgiven, for she loved much." So in conclusion, it is clear that Lord of the Rings, despite their scarcity, the female characters are powerful in the battle against evil. As female characters in a Christian myth, they point towards the archetype of the feminine, the Blessed Virgin Mary. As such, they display all the traits of the feminine genius, a sacrificial love born of an orientation toward the person and an openness towards the other. As mother, bride, and sister-daughter, they inspire and draw out love in the male characters. The feminine is central, not peripheral, to the defeat of evil in The Lord of the Rings. Just as the woman, the Virgin Mary, is central to the Christian story, the true myth of the redemption of humanity through her yes to God's plan. Thank you.